Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Smash Mammon with Jonah P. Overton. I am Jonah P. Overton. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a church planter, a community organizer, an activist, a follower of Jesus, and a Christian socialist. You may notice a couple of things today. One is that I am guestless. This is my first ever solo episode, so thanks for hanging with me today. Really reflecting on some of the material that's come out of ICS lately, including the webinar this past week that is still available on our Facebook and elsewhere. But with the Wendland Cook program in Religion and Justice, this series of conversations about Christianity and socialism. So I'm going to reflect on that today. You may also be hearing in my voice that I have been under the weather. So excuse my frogginess and know that I am just that committed to being live with you every Thursday to really unpack what it means to be a Christian socialist. There, so much ground was covered in this webinar, Engaging Christianity and Socialism's Part 2. And if you've got 90 minutes, I really recommend that you check the whole thing out. But one of the things that it really raised me was I was incredibly intrigued. There was a great discussion about, not being class reductionist, which is to say, like, when we talk about socialism, what exactly are we engaging? Which parts of our human experience are we prioritizing? And where is our analysis? And there are a lot of socialists, not specific to Christian socialists, but there are a lot of socialists are frequently and often rightly accused of falling into something called class reductionism. So this idea that class status sort of overrides any other concerns or oppressions. And that's something that ICS and this group of people, scholars, thinkers, clearly rejects, that intersectionality is incredibly important to any understanding of socialism, and that that to try and divorce or even class politics in any way from the realities of racism, patriarchy, misogyny, ableism, queerphobia, that those things are they're so deeply entwined. Jeremy Posadas had something great. I believe he said something to the effect of racism and patriarchy are not self-funded. And I really loved that, because it's true. These are projects that are funded, undergirded by capitalism, and engaging directly with all of them is of the overall project. So I loved that conversation, that really rich conversation in the beginning about essentially what it takes to undermine capitalism, what it takes to be anti-capitalist, which is also to be in deep solidarity, not only with our understanding of the working class in terms of class politics, but all of the other multitudes of identities held by working class peoples. And really prioritizing, for instance, anti-racist work in our anti-capitalist work, to say we're not going to be able to unpack one without unpacking the other. Nor would we want to. And I think, so I love that discussion. But after that, there was this other discussion that I think comes up a lot when I talk to people about the Institute of Christian Socialism. And I'd love to hear in comments what other people are thinking about this. But the question was basically like, okay, so if we've established that socialism has to be, rooted in solidarity, that that any socialism worth its salt is going to be intersectional, that this is a holistic project of liberation for all people from these layers of oppression that are like driven by capitalism in these profound ways and are like identifiable as other strains of oppression, like that all these things are woven together, like are on board. Why is this a Christian thing? Or like, how do we make sure that we're doing this as Christians rather than letting socialism itself sort of super our identity as Christians? Why, as followers of Jesus, are we called into this project? How are those things together and not competing or separate? And for me, it's such a weird to engage, because I feel at such a instinctive level that these things go together, it's hard for me to even tease them apart sometimes. A week or so ago, a couple weeks ago maybe, I threw up on my Facebook profile, like, who here identifies as both a Christian and a socialist? And I got a lot of fun responses. A lot of people were like, very excited to identify in those ways, which I think is really cool. And I think is an increase. We're seeing an increase in public conversation about Christian socialism and socialism in general. And so people coming out of the woodwork, people I wouldn't have expected. And I was like, this is a really fun social experiment to see how my network reacts to this and how many people are really starting to actually put these ideas together. Oh, these are fundamentally intertwined for me. But there were a lot of people who were making comments or jokes along the lines of, well, what's the difference between a Christian and a socialist? And I thought that was, I'm right there with that joke, with that energy that, like, yes, this is what it means. What it means to be a Christian is to socialism as a mechanism for liberation for all of God's people, because we see that in this moment in history, like that is how this will come into being. These frameworks of the gospel and of solidarity are like so bound up in the world we live in this way that, like, this is where we are called to go. But that's obviously really different than the mainline narrative we get about what it means to be a Christian or to be a socialist. And I know that there are lots of people doing work about what it means to be a socialist and kind of debunking some of the Red Scare, mythology that we have in pop culture about, like, scary socialists. But I think it's really worth unpacking as a community. And again, this is where I'm really interested to hear from you all in comments. I'm really interested to hear, like, how people are piecing together what it means to be Christian in a way that leads us to the project of socialism and the kinds of solidarity and the kinds of liberationist work that we associate with it. And I think that one of the major tensions here is around the idea of individual salvation, or rather, it's not at all. Like, what is salvation? What is salvation in the Christian understanding? And I think that the reason we end up with so many gaps between people who are Christian socialists, people who are part of a Jesus movement of solidarity and justice for all people here on this earth as well as into eternity, versus, like, this highly Americanized, individualized Christianity with a salvation connected to this prayer and kind of getting a ticket into paradise. That tension emerges because we have fundamentally different understandings of what it is we need to be saved from. And I have had we'll call it privilege of being cultivated in my own life and journey from childhood through adolescence into adulthood through a number of different Christian communities, including mainline Protestants, including communities of radical leftist Christians, and also including some very conservative evangelicals. Honestly, like, culturally at my heart, I identify as an evangelical. There are parts of my faith that are deeply evangelical. And yet this tension, I have, like, full clarity on it for myself. That personally, I believe that Jesus Christ, God's own self, came to be with us incarnate in the world as an act of solidarity. And one of the things that really stood out to me in this conversation the other night was when Tim Eberhard, actually, I wrote this down because I was like, I've never, like, heard this framed this way. But he was talking about the Wesleyan way. He's a United Methodist elder. And he phrased that as God's solidarity with us in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit. And immediately I was like, yeah, like, yes, that's what it is. This is holy solidarity. This is divine solidarity. The mission is not a project to save us from a bloodthirsty God through sacrifice on the cross in this kind of Anselmian substitutionary penal substitutionary atonement. It's solidarity. It's presence. It's God's own self, like, throwing skin in the game, literally, and saying like, I am here. I have a stake at this because you have a stake in this. And we are together and it matters. And so that understanding of Jesus as solidarity, as the Holy Spirit infusing creation with presence of solidarity, is a fundamentally different relationship to the divine than one of substitutionary atonement that says we are garbage. We are held individual for our individual garbage. We've got to pass a kind of test so that we can get into heaven and be rewarded in paradise. And I don't know how we reconcile that. I don't know how we move into spaces, because I also know that there are Christian socialists who do believe in penal substitutionary atonement. And so if you are one of those, if you're like, yes, I get it, solidarity, cool, and, Jesus died on the cross for my sins in this very specific way, and that's fundamental to my faith, I want to hear from you as well in comments, because I think we need to learn to have this conversation across different theologies of salvation. And if salvation has no room for liberation from cruelty and oppression and evil in this life, then to me, it cannot claim to be of Jesus or of the scriptures. Also in this discussion, Sarah New talked about the book of Acts and how in their tradition and in their church where they preach, Sarah uses a lot of scriptural references because they're like, the Bible is just like incredibly important to my community. We need to root everything in scripture. And so like when we're talking about this, we neglect engaging, for instance, the book of Acts and talking about what it means to hold everything in common. And Sarah actually went on, they quoted one of the early church fathers as saying, the bread you have on your shelf is stolen from a poor person, right? To say not only that like we ought to like give and be generous, but also that we need to understand fundamentally that property is theft. And like that's a very leftist idea. Property is theft. And that's like baked right into the early church, this understanding that that earthly understandings of material property and ownership are theft not only from God, and I think that's how it's sometimes framed, like, oh yeah, it belongs to God, therefore, if I have too much of a sense of ownership over it, I'm betraying God. But like that frame, this quote is not about that. It's about the poor, that property is theft from one another, that anything that isn't needed but is still hoarded is stolen. And I think that for me is where we get to the core of the gospel of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus that we had in his life, which is that, in Jesus's economy, if you really kind of break down, like, what is the economic system that we see Jesus talking about, which can get really dicey, right? Like, I don't want to pretend that Jesus had like a fully fleshed economic theory. That's not really his jam. We don't need to like retcon, economic theory into Jesus. But Jesus's philosophy, at least, of provision, which I think we can talk about with boldness, is one of enough, one of there being enough for all. So in God's economy, as described by Jesus in Jesus' teachings, there is enough for all. And that's like fundamentally it. Like there just is enough. And God is like, I got you. I got the birds. I got the lilies. Like I got you too. What, and then Jesus comes in and talks about what gets disrupted. Oh, you're storing up grains? You're going to die anyway. And then they're just going to be there. And what have you done except disrupt this economy of enough for all? God has provided enough for all of us, but it is greed and hoarding. And this is the gospel of Jesus, and the economy of enough for all really clashes at its heart with capitalism. Because capitalism, if I could summarize similarly, is an economy of never enough. Capitalism is the economy of never enough. And you can look at that on either pole, right? Capitalism is the economy of never enough because it does seem to be enough to go around. Within capitalism, there are always people who have less than enough. There's always scarcity. God's economy of abundance, enough for all. Capitalism is an economy of scarcity. And on the other side, on the wealthy side of capitalism, there's this never enoughness of like endless accumulation. The expansive nature of capitalism that says there will never be enough until ever, right? Like there just is no end point. It expands forever and ever and ever. It hoards and it wants more and more and more. And so capitalism can never be satisfied. Whereas God's economy is all about saying it's enough to satisfy all if you will be satisfied with being satisfied. If you will be satisfied with providing for one another, with trusting in me and one another. If you will be satisfied with enough, then there is enough for everyone. And so for me, when I'm thinking about what it means to be a Christian socialist, I'm thinking about how to create a world in which there is enough and where enough is enough. That we don't need to extract continuously from the earth and from one another, from laborers, to get more and more and more, but to actually celebrate and live and thrive within the abundance of God who created a world that is enough, and to be satisfied by that fully and provided for fully and provide for one another in that way. And this gets to what Aubrey Hendricks was talking about fundamentally, which is like the gospel is a gospel of love, and that Jesus's metrics for whether we are living the gospel are whether we are loving our neighbor as ourselves, whether we are loving God, and that Aubrey referred to it as the primary mode of judgment. The primary mode of judgment that Jesus offers is in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, saying, did you provide enough for your kin? Did you show up? Did you offer what you had to one another? Or did you leave that shelf full of bread that was stolen from the poor? And so for me, I come from this place where part of what it means to be a Christian is to sit on your, get down on your knees and say the right words and accept Jesus into your heart. And that may be a part of that personal transformation that's really fundamental to changing the world. And I don't want to dismiss that. And if we are not compelled as Christians then to create the world where there is enough, we have lost the heart of the gospel of Jesus, which is that we are to love one another. And that love for one another is not about saving our own skin. It's not about getting our own individual ticket into heaven, but is about creating the kingdom where enough is enough is enough. So that's what I got for y'all today. Thanks for being here, and excited to continue engaging this conversation. Next week, I believe Tim Eberhardt, who was on the webinar, will be with us talking about creation and eco-justice and eco-theology. So be sure to tune in next week on Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll have that conversation. And as always, if you haven't yet, like and subscribe to the Institute for Christian Socialism on Facebook, YouTube, and elsewhere. We love to build community and keep having these conversations that inspire us to grow and to be more and more full in our faith, not only as individuals, but again, as community, as a community of others. So good to be with y'all, and I'll see you next week.